In the spring of 1778, deep in the forests of upstate New York, 200 ironworkers labored around the clock at a remote forge, hammering out iron links the size of a man's torso. They had 6 weeks to finish. If they failed, the British Navy would sail up the Hudson River unopposed, split the American colonies in half, and very possibly end the revolution before it had a chance to succeed. This was not a battle fought with muskets or cannon. It was a battle fought with hammers, charcoal, and 1,200 tons of iron. And almost nobody alive today has ever heard of the man who built the weapon that stopped an empire's navy without firing a single shot. To understand why a chain mattered more than an army, you have to understand the Hudson River itself. The Hudson was not just a river. It was the single most important strategic corridor in the entire American Revolution. It ran nearly 200 miles from New York City in the south to the Canadian border in the north, cutting straight through the heart of the 13 colonies. Whoever controlled the Hudson controlled the ability to move troops, supplies, and cannon between New England and the rest of the rebellion. Sever that river and you sever New England, the birthplace of the Revolution, from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and every colony south of it. British strategists in London understood this from the very first year of the war. It was the same logic behind the Saratoga campaign, the same reasoning that sent Burgoyne marching south from Canada in 1777. Control the Hudson, and the rebellion dies of isolation. There was only one problem for the British. The Royal Navy could not simply sail up the Hudson and claim it. American engineers had spent years turning the river itself into a weapon, and the centerpiece of that defense was something almost absurdly simple in concept and almost impossibly difficult to build. A chain stretched bank to bank, strong enough to stop a warship in its tracks. The first attempt came in 1776, when American engineers strung an iron chain across the river near Fort Montgomery, a rocky American stronghold roughly 40 miles north of New York City, guarding a narrow stretch of the Hudson known as the Popolopan Gorge. That first chain was crude by later standards, forged from whatever iron stock could be scavenged and assembled in a hurry. It was reinforced with a floating log boom to help absorb the impact of a ship's hull. On paper, it looked like a solution. In October of 1777, it was tested for real, and it failed catastrophically. Sir Henry Clinton, commanding British forces from New York City, launched a diversionary assault up the Hudson, timed to support Burgoyne's invasion from the north. On the 6th of October 1777, roughly 2,000 British and Hessian troops stormed Fort Montgomery and the neighboring Fort Clinton in a brutal twilight assault. The American garrisons, badly outnumbered, fought hard but were overwhelmed within hours. Once the forts fell, British sailors moved in and physically dismantled the chain, hauling its massive links out of the water piece by piece. The first great obstacle on the Hudson was gone, and for one terrifying week in October of 1777, the British Navy had a clear, unobstructed path all the way up the river toward Albany. Here is the detail almost nobody remembers. Burgoyne did not know it. Trapped and starving at Saratoga, surrounded by Horatio Gates's swelling militia army, Burgoyne had no idea that the Hudson had briefly opened wide behind enemy lines to his south. British ships actually pushed as far north as Kingston, New York, burning the town to the ground on the 16th of October. But it was too little, too late, and far too far from Saratoga to matter. One day later, on the 17th of October, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. The open river had come 1 week too late to save him. But American commanders looked at what had just happened at Fort Montgomery and understood something with total clarity. If the British ever got a second chance to control the Hudson, the whole war could still be lost. The chain had to be rebuilt, and this time it had to be strong enough that it could never be dismantled in an afternoon. The man given the impossible task of building an unbreakable river chain was not a general. He was not even a soldier. His name was Peter Townsend, and he ran an ironworks deep in the forests of what is now Orange County, New York, a place called Sterling Forge, roughly 25 miles from the river itself. Townsend came from a family of ironmasters, Quakers by faith, who had built their business on decades of quiet, unglamorous industrial work, smelting ore and forging tools for a colonial economy that desperately needed iron for everything from plowshares to musket barrels. Townsend was not a wealthy aristocrat, and he was not seeking glory. He was a tradesman who understood metal the way Daniel Morgan understood militia, and George Washington understood men, deeply, practically, and without illusions. In February of 1778, the commander of West Point, Brigadier General Israel Putnam, and the Continental Congress's own chief engineer, a Polish volunteer named Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the same officer who had designed the fortifications at Saratoga, settled on West Point as the new choke point for the river. West Point sat at one of the sharpest bends in the entire Hudson, a spot where the river narrowed and turned almost 90 degrees, forcing any ship under sail to slow down dramatically to make the turn. It was, in engineering terms, the single best possible location on the entire river to stop a warship dead in the water. Congress approved the plan, and a contract went out to Peter Townsend and the Sterling Ironworks. The order was almost unbelievable in scope. Congress needed a chain stretching roughly 500 yards across the Hudson, built from individual iron links, each measuring over 2 feet long, each one forged from bars of wrought iron nearly 2.5 inches thick. Every single link had to be strong enough to survive the shock of a fully rigged warship striking it at speed, and the whole assembly, once complete, would weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 tons. And Congress needed it finished in 6 weeks. Townsend had no factory capable of mass production. He had a forge, a handful of skilled ironworkers, and access to bog iron ore dug from the surrounding hills. What he did next was, in its own quiet way, just as remarkable as anything Steuben accomplished on the parade ground at Valley Forge. He organized his entire operation around a single relentless production line. Teams of blacksmiths worked in continuous rotating shifts, day and night, hammering raw iron bars into shape over roaring charcoal furnaces. The forge never went cold. Men slept in shifts while the fires kept burning. Each link had to be individually hand-forged, heated, white-hot, bent into an oval, and hammered closed at the seam by men swinging sledgehammers in a rhythm that had to be perfect, because a single flawed weld anywhere along 500 yards of chain could mean the entire barrier snapping apart under the weight of a British man-of-war. Picture the scene inside that forge in the freezing final weeks of winter 1778. The heat from a dozen furnaces roaring against sub-zero air outside, the rhythmic clang of hammers on hot iron, a sound that never stopped, morning or night, for 6 straight weeks. Sparks arcing off the anvils, men with blistered hands and scorched leather aprons, working through exhaustion because they understood, in the same way the soldiers freezing at Valley Forge understood, that this was not ordinary labor. This was the last line of defense between the British Navy and the total collapse of the Northern War effort. The chain was completed in an almost impossible 6 weeks, but forging the links was only half the challenge. Now came the problem of moving over 100 tons of iron 25 miles through rugged, half-frozen forest terrain to the banks of the Hudson River, with no railroads, no paved roads, and no modern machinery of any kind. Townsend's teams loaded the massive links onto heavy ox-drawn wagons and dragged them link by link over crude forest trails toward the river, a journey that itself became a minor logistical epic, wagon wheels sinking into mud, axles snapping under the strain, oxen straining against loads heavier than anything they had ever pulled. Once the iron reached the river, engineers under Kosciuszko's direction assembled the chain link by link directly onto a massive system of 40-foot log rafts, each raft designed to float the chain at the correct depth, buoyant enough to keep the iron near the surface where it would strike an oncoming ship's hull, but heavy enough to resist being dragged under by the current. The completed chain was anchored on both banks of the river with enormous stone blocks and iron cable stretched taut across the water at West Point's narrowest bend, reinforced by a floating log boom positioned just upstream to absorb the initial shock of any ship's impact before the chain itself took the strain. On the 24th of April 1778, engineers stretched the completed chain across the Hudson River for the first time. It held. Here is what almost nobody realizes about the Great Chain at West Point. It was never actually struck by a British warship, not once in the entire remaining 5 years of the war. And that fact is not a footnote. That fact is the entire point. British naval commanders were not fools. They understood iron, they understood ships, and they understood exactly what would happen to a wooden hull moving at speed if it collided with 2.5 inches of forged wrought iron, reinforced by a log boom and backed by cannon batteries positioned on the bluffs above. The chain did not need to sink a ship to succeed. It needed only to make the risk of trying so obviously catastrophic that the Royal Navy chose, again and again, for 5 straight years, never to test it. This is a strategic principle that echoes across military history far beyond the Hudson. Sometimes the most effective weapon in an entire war is the one an enemy looks at and decides is simply not worth the gamble. West Point itself became, almost overnight, the most heavily fortified position in North America, specifically because of what that chain represented. Washington understood its value so completely that he personally moved his own headquarters to West Point for extended periods, and he referred to the fortress as the key to the continent. If the British had ever seized West Point and controlled the river above and below the chain, the entire strategic nightmare that nearly killed the revolution during the Saratoga campaign could have repeated itself, this time with no scorched earth wilderness and no militia surge to stop it. And this is precisely why, 2 years later, in 1780, one of the most infamous betrayals in American history centered on this exact location. Benedict Arnold, embittered after Saratoga, humiliated by accusations of corruption and drowning in debt, requested and received command of West Point in the summer of 1780. It was not a coincidence. Arnold understood, better than almost any other American officer alive, exactly how valuable this position was. He had spent years fighting to defend the very corridor the chain protected, and he decided to sell it. Arnold began secret negotiations with the British, offering to weaken the fortress's defenses and hand over West Point, chain included, in exchange for £20,000 and a commission in the British Army. His British contact, Major John Andre, was captured behind American lines, carrying documents detailing West Point's fortifications hidden in his boot. Andre was tried and hanged as a spy. Arnold escaped to a British warship on the Hudson just hours before his treason was discovered, fleeing down the very river his own chain had helped protect for 2 years. The Great Chain very nearly fell not to a naval assault, but to betrayal from within, sold by the very general trusted to guard it. The chain remained stretched across the Hudson at West Point for the rest of the war, replaced and reinforced periodically as sections weakened or shifted with the seasons. Each winter, before the river froze solid enough to threaten the chain's anchor points, engineers would haul sections up onto shore for inspection and repair, then re-stretch it across the water each spring when the ice cleared. It stayed in place until the war's end in 1783, a permanent, silent deterrent that never once needed to prove itself in combat because its entire value lay in never being tested at all. After the Revolution, the chain was declared surplus and, in one of history's more undignified footnotes, much of it was sold off for scrap iron. Some sections were melted down. Other links were kept as souvenirs, sold to collectors and historical societies over the following decades. Today, 13 original links from the Great Chain survive, displayed on the grounds of the United States Military Academy at West Point, the very ground it was built to defend, now home to the institution that trains the officers who study men like Steuben, Morgan, and Kosciuszko as case studies in discipline, strategy, and engineering. Visitors can walk up and touch links of iron forged in the freezing winter of 1778 by ironworkers whose names history barely remembers. Peter Townsend never became a household name. He was not knighted, he received no statue in a public park, no county in New York bears his name the way Steuben's does. He returned to running his ironworks after the war, continuing a quiet industrial life that had briefly, urgently intersected with the fate of a revolution. But without his forge, without 200 anonymous blacksmiths hammering through 6 freezing weeks in 1778, the Hudson River may well have reopened to the Royal Navy exactly as it had for that one catastrophic week in October of 1777. This time with no Saratoga surrender to redeem the disaster, no French alliance forged in the aftermath, and no guarantee that the war would have ended the way it did. Sometimes the most decisive weapon in history is not a general, not an army, and not even a battle. Sometimes it is 140 tons of iron, hammered link by men whose names never made it into the history books, stretched across a river specifically so that it would never, ever have to be used. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment with the most underrated piece of military engineering you think changed the course of a war. And if you learned something new today, smash that like button so more people can find this video.